Before empires fall, they whisper, and before they rise, they dream. Somewhere between the dust of Asia and the marble of Europe, that dream took form, vast, disciplined, and devout. The Ottomans did not just build an empire, they built a rhythm that outlived its architects, a heartbeat that echoed through continents. But here's the mystery. How does something so powerful fade? Not with thunder, but with silence. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not a tale of conquest alone. It is a meditation on endurance, on how the hands that wield power one day tremble the next. It begins not in a palace, but in a tent beneath stars that saw both nomads and kings. And before we unfold the centuries, before the armies march and the domes glisten, a small favour, fellow traveller of history, lend your curiosity. Like and subscribe to this journey, because where we're going, the past breathes louder than the present. The winds over Anatolia were not kind, they carried dust, prayer and rumour. In those early days, the tribe of Osman was a whisper in the shadow of dying powers. Byzantium, exhausted but proud. Mongols, fading but feared. The Ottomans were not supposed to last. And yet history loves irony. The kind that turns wanderers into emperors. Imagine it. Tents scattered along the edge of the Byzantine world, horses steaming in the cold dawn, and men speaking of destiny as if it were a nearby mountain they could simply climb. Osman, their leader, was no conqueror in legend yet. But the stories grew like vines, that he dreamed of a tree rising from his chest, branches stretching from the Balkans to Arabia. Dreams, after all, are the first architecture of empire. From those dreams, the Ottomans learned a dangerous secret: patience. While others charged, they waited. While kingdoms decayed, they observed. And when the time came, they moved like the wind itself, unseen until unstoppable. They conquered not only with the sword, but with silence, with alliances that turned enemies into administrators, and a faith that turned ordinary men into instruments of fate. Mosques rose where churches once stood, and the call to prayer mingled with the echo of bells that had not yet realised their time had passed. But the Ottomans were more than warriors. They were architects of order. From Istanbul's marble halls to the bazaars of Cairo, they built a world where power wore the mask of divinity. Every archway spoke of balance, every courtyard of control. They were the hinge between East and West, between tradition and innovation, between the living and the eternal. And yet, beneath the gold leaf and calligraphy, the same question haunted them. Does power ever outlive the people who built it? The early sultans moved like myths through their own courts. Orhan, Murad, Bayezid, names that struck fear and reverence in equal measure. They expanded the frontier not by crushing the old world, but by absorbing it. Greek architects built their mosques, Persian scholars wrote their laws, Arab poets sanctified their rule. Empire to the Ottomans was less a border than a conversation, one that never truly ended. When Mehmed II took Constantinople in 1453, the world gasped. The Christian stronghold that had stood for 1,000 years fell not only to cannons but to vision. Where others saw walls, Mehmed saw a future capital, a city reborn as Istanbul, where continents kissed beneath his minarets. The Hagia Sophia's great dome trembled with a new kind of prayer, and in that trembling began the modern age. It was a conquest not of destruction, but of inheritance. Mehmed did not erase, he transformed, and that perhaps was the Ottoman genius. The ability to wear the faces of those they conquered, until those faces forgot they had ever been different. But power is addictive, and like any addiction, it demands both brilliance and blindness. In the marble corridors of Topkapi, beneath painted ceilings and perfumed gardens, the machinery of empire turned, smooth, intricate, merciless. Courtiers whispered, viziers plotted, poets flattered, and the Sultan watched it all with a calm that came from knowing every loyalty was conditional. The Ottoman system was genius because it trusted no one completely. Even the Janissaries, the elite soldiers stolen as boys and raised to serve the Sultan, were both weapon and warning. Power must always be renewed, purified through obedience. The Janissaries had no families, no inheritance, no home but the empire. They were its soul and its shadow, loyal until they weren't, and when they turned centuries later, it would be their own creation that would burn them. But that is another chapter. For now, the empire still rises. From the deserts of Arabia to the walls of Vienna, The crescent banner stretched farther than Rome's eagle had ever flown. Pilgrims, traders, scholars all passed through the Ottoman arteries, carrying languages and dreams that would shape the modern world. They were not merely rulers, they were custodians of civilization, and yet the marble halls whispered of decay, even in their glory. For the desert winds do not care for empires. They strip all things to bone eventually. There is a certain beauty in the Ottoman paradox. An empire so vast it united 3 continents, yet so fragile that a whisper in the harem could shift the course of armies. Power was absolute, and yet always borrowed. Faith was eternal, and yet always tested. In this world, even silence had hierarchy. The Sultan's quiet was command, the muezzin's call a reminder, the scholar's ink a weapon sharper than steel. From Baghdad to Budapest, markets hummed with life. Scholars debated beneath lanterns and architects stretched stone toward heaven. The Ottomans believed that beauty itself was proof of divine favour. Their cities glowed not with gold, but with symmetry, a visible rhythm of faith and discipline. But every empire builds a mirror of its soul, and when that mirror cracks, the reflection turns cruel. For behind the glory lay control, behind the faith, fear, and beneath the vastness a loneliness only the powerful understand. It is easy to forget that the Ottoman Empire was never one thing. It was 1,000 nations bound by law, by prayer, by the shared illusion that one centre could hold so many edges. Turks ruled, yes, but Greeks traded, Armenians crafted, Arabs preached, Jews financed, and Slavs served. It was a mosaic, beautiful and brittle, held together by the promise that the Sultan's justice was universal. But justice, like marble, cracks under pressure. Every generation must remake it, or watch it crumble. And so the Ottomans adapted. They reformed, absorbed, evolved. When Europe began to awaken in the Renaissance, they watched with measured curiosity. When printing presses began to hum, they hesitated, fearing the written word more than the canon. Knowledge was both salvation and threat, and perhaps that hesitation was the first quiet tremor of decline. Because while the desert winds carried prayer, Europe's winds carried ideas. Still, in that long dawn of power, there was splendour beyond imagination. Picture it. The domes of Istanbul glowing under moonlight, ships crowding the Bosphorus like silver scales, and the call to prayer rolling across the water like an ancient heartbeat. In the palaces, every gesture was ceremony, every silence strategy. It was theatre disguised as governance, and governance disguised as destiny. The Ottomans believed themselves chosen, and for centuries the world agreed. Their rivals fell, their allies bent the knee, their scholars debated the cosmos while their architects sculpted eternity from stone. It was for a time perfection. But perfection is a dangerous illusion, because when you believe your order is divine, you stop listening for change. History moves in whispers before it roars. While the empire basked in its own glow, the world shifted. New oceans were crossed, new continents mapped, new sciences born. Europe, once the Ottomans' anxious neighbour, became the restless innovator. An innovation, the quiet rebellion of the mind, would one day conquer what armies could not. Still, in this moment the Ottomans stood tall, their shadow stretching across centuries. Their power seemed eternal, and yet every sunset over Istanbul carried a warning. The same sun that gilds the dome also hides the night. For all its might, the empire was still human. Fragile, ambitious, beautiful, afraid. When you walk through Istanbul today, you can still hear it. In the echo of your own footsteps. The city hums with ghosts. Each stone remembers a prayer, a secret, a betrayal. The empire may be gone, but the architecture of its dreams remains. Mosques stand where sultans once plotted, bridges span where armies once camped. The marble halls endure, but the hands that built them are dust. Perhaps that is the final truth of empire. It does not die, it transforms into memory. The Ottomans did not vanish. They dissolved into the cities we live in, the words we speak, the faiths we inherit. Every echo of power becomes a story eventually, so the mystery remains. Does power ever outlive the people who built it? Or does it simply change its mask and wait for us to forget? The desert winds still move, The marble still gleams, the prayers still rise, and in that balance of permanence and loss lies the soul of the Ottoman Empire, both shadow and light, both empire and echo. Its rise was a symphony of ambition, its fall a whisper of inevitability. But in between, in that long twilight where continents met and faith-guided empire, humanity glimpsed what it means to hold eternity, if only for a moment. So let's begin. Empires do not fall in a single night. They unravel, thread by thread, silence by silence. The Ottoman Empire, once a celestial machine turning with divine precision, began to grind under its own weight. Power, after all, does not die in battle. It decays in comfort. The first whispers of decline came not from foreign cannons, but from within. In marble corridors once alive with ambition, a new rhythm emerged. Hesitation. Sultans who once rode at the front of armies now ruled from behind gilded screens. Decisions passed through layers of courtiers, each trimming a little truth to please the ear above, and so the empire began to lose something it had once mastered. Motion. The winds that had carried their banners across continents now grew restless. Trade routes shifted, ideas escaped, and the world beyond the empire began to hum with a new mechanical music, the sound of progress. While Europe discovered engines and enlightenment, the Ottomans stood in the glow of yesterday's triumph, mistaking memory for momentum. But history rarely announces its turning points. They arrive disguised, in letters, in reforms, in whispers. The 17th century brought such a disguise, a rebellion of ideas. Across the palaces of Istanbul, old certainties began to tremble. The Janissaries, once loyal sons of the empire, had grown powerful. Too powerful. They demanded privileges, money, influence. Once an elite brotherhood, they became a mob in silk uniforms, extorting sultans and deciding successions. When Osman II tried to discipline them, they dragged him through the streets and strangled him with a bowstring. The message was clear. The empire's sword had turned inward. The protector had become the predator. From that moment, fear replaced authority. Every reformer walked carefully. Every decree was softened. The empire had learned to fear itself, and there is no deadlier fear. Still, the Ottoman rhythm endured, even as its melody changed. The court refined its rituals, poetry replaced conquest. The empire's scholars debated theology while its borders quietly receded. And in the cafes of Europe, men spoke of liberty, of science, of reason, words that travelled faster than armies. The Ottomans watched, half in admiration, half in dread. Because every empire faces the same paradox. To survive, it must change, but change too much, and it ceases to be itself. Reform became both necessity and heresy. In the 18th century, Sultan Selim III dared to dream of renewal. He built new schools, new armies, new hopes. But the old guard, the Janissaries, saw betrayal where he saw salvation. They rose again, as they always did, strangling progress in the name of tradition. Selim's reforms died with him, but their ghost lingered. It is the cruel joke of history that the future often begins with failure. The ideas Selim planted took root in younger minds, among soldiers, bureaucrats, thinkers. They began to whisper of a new world, one where the empire could modernize without losing its soul. But the empire's soul was tired. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, the world no longer waited. The French Revolution had set Europe aflame with the promise of change. Napoleon's armies stormed across continents, and when they reached Egypt in 1798, they brought not only soldiers but scientists, engineers, and maps. The Ottoman world stared in awe. For centuries they had been the keepers of civilization. Now they looked upon a new kind of power, one measured not in faith or territory, but in knowledge. The Enlightenment had redrawn the rules, and the Ottomans were playing yesterday's game. The empire's borders quivered under pressure. In Greece, independence flared like wildfire. Serbia rose in rebellion. Egypt drifted toward autonomy under the charismatic Muhammad Ali, who spoke the language of modernization in a tone the sultans could no longer command. Even as the empire fought to hold its lands, the very idea of empire was dying in the world's imagination. People no longer believed in divine right, they believed in nations, and nations do not kneel easily. But the Ottoman heart, Istanbul, still glittered. Foreign envoys marvelled at its beauty, domes like pearls, palaces like dreams. They called it the sick man of Europe, but few dared say it aloud in the Sultan's presence, because even sick, the empire was dangerous. Even dying, it could still wound. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century were a last great attempt to heal the body of the state. New schools, new laws, new visions of equality. Ottoman subjects were to become citizens. Christians, Jews and Muslims were promised the same rights. It was a noble experiment and a desperate one. But old habits die slower than dynasties. Reform collided with religion, with pride, with inertia. Bureaucrats wrote new codes while pashas whispered old conspiracies. Progress came dressed in Western uniforms, and many feared it would strip away everything Ottoman in the process. Still, there were moments of brilliance, a flicker of the empire's old genius. Railways, telegraphs, newspapers. For a while it seemed the Ottoman world might bridge faith and modernity, east and west. But bridges can collapse under too much weight. Then came the storm that no empire could withstand, the 20th century. Nationalism, that fever of identity, swept through the empire's provinces like wildfire. The Balkans burned first. Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, each reclaimed their myth, their memory, their homeland. To the Ottomans, it felt like betrayal. To the rebels, it felt like rebirth. The empire that had once united difference under law now found difference tearing it apart. The same mosaic that had dazzled the world began to crack, each piece pulling toward its own gravity. And yet the Sultan still sat beneath his dome, listening to reports of distant rebellions as though they were storms on another sea. When the Young Turks rose in 1908, demanding constitutional government and reform, it was not revolution but resurrection, or so they hoped. They promised freedom, modernization, unity, but freedom is never clean, and modernization always arrives with a price. The old palace elite clashed with the new officers, the believers with the skeptics, the dreamers with the pragmatists. And through it all, the empire aged another century in a single decade. Then came the war that ended all empires. World War I did not kill the Ottomans. It revealed their death had already begun. Alliances made in desperation turned to chains. They sided with Germany, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear of being left behind. The empire's armies marched again, but this time under skies filled with machines they did not build, against nations they no longer understood. At Gallipoli they fought with courage, with brilliance even, holding off the British in a battle that would make legends of both sides. But courage cannot heal rot. The war bled them dry, of men, of faith, of illusion. And when the guns finally fell silent, the world they had ruled for 6 centuries was gone. The treaties carved their lands like meat on a table. Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Arabia, all divided, occupied, renamed. Istanbul itself trembled under foreign flags. The empire that once measured time by prayer now counted its days by foreign decrees. Yet even in ruin, the Ottoman legacy refused to vanish quietly. From the ashes rose a man who embodied both the empire's discipline and its defiance, Mustafa Kemal, later called Ataturk. He was not a sultan, but a soldier of reason. Where the old order had sought divine mandate, he sought national will, and with that the final transformation began. The sultanate was abolished. The caliphate, and that ancient symbol of unitas, dissolved. In its place stood a republic, secular, modern, unyielding. The old banners were folded, the minarets silenced for a moment of reckoning. It was not merely the fall of an empire, it was the death of an idea, that faith and sword could rule the world forever. But in every ending hides a strange kind of justice, because in losing everything, the Ottomans gave birth to something new. The modern Middle East, the modern Balkans, even the modern idea of global balance between East and West. Their fall redrew the map of humanity. Still, one must ask, how does a civilization so magnificent become so fragile? Perhaps the answer lies not in battles, but in belief. The Ottomans believed their system divine, their hierarchy eternal, and in that faith they forgot the one rule no empire escapes. Nothing built by humans is sacred forever. Empires survive not by conquest, but by adaptation. And the Ottomans, for all their splendour, could not change fast enough. Their marble halls became mausoleums of memory, their scholars guardians of ghosts. Progress knocked and they hesitated, and hesitation in history is the first form of surrender. Still, we must not mistake their fall for failure. Because what they built was not merely territory, it was texture. They shaped cities, languages, and laws. They left art that still hums with eternity. They proved that faith and intellect could coexist, if only briefly, in a world forever tilting toward chaos. Even in decline, they taught the world how to fall with grace, how to bow to history without breaking. The desert winds still remember their songs. The marble still holds their breath. The empire died, yes, but its shadow remained, stretching across the modern world like a question that refuses an answer. And so we return to that question once more. Does power ever outlive the people who built it? Perhaps it does. Not in palaces or armies, but in the ideas and dreams that survive their collapse. Perhaps power is less about control and more about continuity, the unseen thread that binds what was to what will be. The Ottoman Empire may have fallen, but its story never did. It still lives, in languages that blend, in cultures that blur, in every city that stands between East and West. And in that twilight between memory and modernity, one can almost hear it, the echo of the muezzin, calling not to prayer, but to remembrance. The empire is gone, but its shadow still moves, fade to silence, a silence filled with memory. Empires end, but the stories they leave behind refuse to die. The Ottoman Empire was not just a state. It was a living memory stretched across continents, languages, and faiths. When its banners fell, the world did not awaken to silence. It awoke to echoes. Echoes in mosques that still rise toward the sky, in recipes that blend cinnamon and sorrow, in languages where Persian poetry meets Turkish discipline and Arabic devotion. What fell in 1922 was not the empire, only its body. Its soul simply changed its name. To understand the Ottoman legacy, you must first listen, not to the cannons of its wars, but to the quiet music it left behind. In the streets of Istanbul, that music still plays, the rhythm of water against stone, the call to prayer weaving through tram bells, the laughter of a cafe where old men debate lost centuries. It is not nostalgia, it is survival. The Ottomans built more than mosques and palaces. They built a memory architecture, vast, intricate, self-sustaining. Each brick carried a philosophy, that beauty was an argument for order, that faith could organise the world, that diversity could be governed without chaos. And for hundreds of years, that illusion worked. When Europe fractured under religious wars, the Ottoman millet system quietly maintained coexistence. Imperfect, yet astonishing for its time. Christians, Jews and Muslims lived under the same crescent shadow. Each allowed their own law, their own faith, their own rhythm of prayer. It was governance as orchestration, a civilization that tuned difference rather than silenced it. Today we call it multiculturalism. The Ottomans simply called it survival. But legacies are never pure. Every light casts its own shadow. The same system that allowed tolerance also demanded obedience. The same beauty that shaped mosques also justified power. To build eternity, they sacrificed change. In the early republics that replaced Ottoman rule, this contradiction lingered like smoke. Turkey, the heir to the empire's heart, turned toward modernity. Steel rails, new alphabets, secular dreams. And yet, beneath the modern facade, the Ottoman rhythm pulsed on. In architecture, in cuisine, in language, even in the pause before a sentence where centuries of diplomacy once lived. To this day, Turkish politics still wrestle with the ghost of the Sultan, progress pulling one way, nostalgia the other. Every reform is haunted by memory, every memory by loss, and perhaps that is what it means to inherit empire, not land, but paradox. Beyond Turkey, the empire's long shadow stretches farther than maps admit. The Balkans hum with Ottoman echoes, bridges arched like prayers, folk songs that carry Arabic words through Slavic throats. In Sarajevo, a mosque stands beside a church, beside a synagogue, the three listening to one another through stone. In Cairo, bureaucracies still bear Ottoman bones, ministries structured like old divans, papers stamped with echoes of imperial order. Even in modern borders, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, you can trace the faint cartographic tremor of Ottoman administration, the ghost lines where empire once drew logic from chaos. The irony is sharp. Nations that once fought to break free now struggle to rebuild the coherence the Ottomans once enforced. Power may die, but structure endures. What makes the Ottoman legacy unique is not merely its longevity, but its ambivalence. It is both pride and burden, both identity and wound. To the modern Middle East, it is memory as mirror, reflecting a time when the region was centre, not periphery, when scholars, not soldiers, defined destiny. And yet, that same memory weighs heavy. Because once you've been the empire, how do you learn to be anything else? In the West, the Ottoman image flickers between fascination and fear. Orientalist paintings cast it in gold and mystery, silken harems, jewelled turbans, a civilization of sensuality and shadow. But behind the fantasy lies the truth, an empire run by scholars and soldiers who understood administration as theology. The Ottomans were not exotic, they were systematic. Their genius was not passion but precision. And that precision, the ability to hold complexity without collapsing, is their true inheritance to modern civilization. Consider the empire's greatest creation, Istanbul itself. A city born from conquest, yet reborn through compassion. When Mehmed II entered Constantinople, he did not burn it, he revived it. He transformed ruin into rhythm, mosaic into mosque, decay into design. That gesture, to inherit, not erase, became the empire's guiding principle. And today, as Istanbul straddles continents, it remains a living metaphor, half memory, half motion. You can stand on the Galata Bridge and feel it, Europe to one side, Asia to the other, and beneath you the Bosphorus, forever translating between worlds. It is not just a river, it is a sentence the empire never finished. Every visitor becomes a reader in that unfinished text, reading history not from books, but from the rhythm of ferry horns, the smell of roasted chestnuts, the call of the seagulls that seem to echo the Adhan. To walk through Istanbul is to walk through time itself. And yet the empire's echo is not confined to stone and story. It lingers in how we imagine power. The Ottomans taught the world that empire could be bureaucratic, multicultural and spiritual all at once. A harmony that Europe would later mimic through colonialism, but never quite understand. Their diplomacy, their religious pragmatism, their obsession with order, all became blueprints for governance long after their palaces turned to museums. Even modern geopolitics hums with Ottoman resonance. The balance between East and West, that eternal tension, was first articulated in their borders. They showed that civilization itself is not a place, but a conversation. And perhaps that is the empire's most radical legacy, the idea that power can connect, not just conquer. Still, history is cruel to dreamers. Every ideal becomes a myth, and every myth eventually a marketing tool. Tourists now photograph what once terrified kings. The empire's ruins have become postcards, its calligraphy a design motif. But look closer, under the surface gloss the old questions still breathe. What is progress if it means forgetting? What is freedom if it erases memory? And what becomes of faith once it is no longer tied to power? The Ottomans struggled with these questions centuries before we did. Their fall was not a tragedy. It was a rehearsal for the modern condition, the endless negotiation between identity and change, between the sacred and the rational. They remind us that the human story is not a ladder, but a spiral. We keep revisiting the same dilemmas, only from different altitudes. There is humour too in the way their legacy lingers. Modern Istanbul's traffic jams unfold on streets designed for horses and carriages, proof that even empire cannot outthink time. Young Turks text across continents once ruled by their ancestors, unaware that their slang borrows Arabic and Persian words older than their republic. Somewhere an Ottoman clerk might be smiling, dry subtle humour in the fact that his handwriting style now decorates coffee mugs. Power fades, but irony endures. If you trace the Ottoman influence through art, the pattern becomes clearer still. Their miniature paintings, delicate, symmetrical, deliberate, taught the world how to see story in silence. Their architecture, with its domes that seem to inhale light, whispered a philosophy, that beauty is not luxury but duty. Even their music, with its slow improvisations and sudden turns, feels like a conversation between humility and grandeur. These were not accidents of style, they were reflections of belief. To the Ottomans, art was not expression, it was order made visible, and that belief, that beauty disciplines the soul still lives wherever the minaret meets the horizon. But perhaps the most enduring Ottoman inheritance is psychological, not architectural. They taught the world how to live with contradiction, to hold faith and doubt in the same breath. In their world, the divine and the mundane were not enemies. A scholar could study astronomy by day and write mystical poetry by night, seeing no contradiction between the stars and the soul. That balance between reason and reverence is a balance modernity has yet to rediscover. When we debate progress today, when we argue whether technology brings us closer or farther from humanity, we echo the same questions Ottoman thinkers once faced. Theirs was an empire of tension, and perhaps tension, not harmony, is the true mark of civilization. It's tempting to say the Ottomans belong to the past, but the truth is we are living inside their afterimage. Our globalized world, with its tangled identities, its cultural negotiations, its restless search for meaning, is their spiritual descendant. They governed difference, we live it. They balanced empires, we balance algorithms. And in both, the challenge is the same: how to remain human in the machinery of power. When we scroll through our modern maps, when we speak of borders, migration or coexistence, we're still speaking Ottoman, even if we've forgotten the language. Because what they built was not just territory, it was a philosophy of connection, and that philosophy still hums beneath the static of modernity, like an old prayer broadcast on new frequencies. Standing before the Hagia Sophia today, you can feel all of it. The layers of faith, ambition, failure, renewal. A Christian cathedral turned mosque, turned museum, turned mosque again. The building itself is history in motion, refusing finality. It reminds us that civilization is not a straight line, but a rhythm. Expansion, collapse, reinvention. Every stone whispers the same truth, that humanity never truly builds anew. It only transforms. The Ottomans understood that better than anyone. They built on what came before, and in doing so became what would come after. Their empire may be gone, but their rhythm remains, and in our architecture, our politics, our faith, our contradictions. So what remains of empire when the banners are gone? Not the power that fades, not the glory that dulls. What remains is the pattern. The way we organise our memories, the way we justify our ambitions, the way we tell ourselves that our order will last. The Ottomans were not the first to believe it, and they will not be the last. Their story is a mirror, one that reflects both the heights of human creation and the limits of human control. They remind us that power, no matter how divine it seems, is only ever rented from time. The desert winds still move, the marble still glows beneath evening prayers. Somewhere in the call of a muezzin, in the shimmer of the Bosphorus, in the laughter of a market that has stood for 500 years, the empire still breathes. They said empires vanish, but perhaps they only change their voice. So listen closely. In every echo of the old world you'll hear the same quiet question rising once more. Does power ever outlive the people who built it? And perhaps the answer is this: only when memory refuses to forget. Fade out, the empire rests, but its shadow walks beside us still.